The Red Sea just became a lot louder, and Ethiopia is no longer watching from the sidelines. This week in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia and the United States signed a strict military cooperation agreement that explicitly ties defense collaboration to Red Sea security. That matters because this is not a symbolic handshake, not a vague memorandum, and not another diplomatic photo op. It is a formal security framework connecting a landlocked African power to one of the most contested maritime corridors on the planet. And yes, global powers noticed. The agreement was signed only days after high-level U.S. strategic consultations in Cairo, a sequence confirmed by statements from the Ethiopian Ministry of Defense and the U.S. Embassy in Addis Ababa. Timing in geopolitics is never accidental. When Washington moved from Cairo to Addis Ababa in the same breath, it is drawing a strategic line across the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea corridor. At the center of that line is the Red Sea itself, a narrow strip of water that carries nearly 12% of global trade, according to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and the International Maritime Organization. Energy shipments, container traffic, and supply chains linking Asia, Europe, and the Middle East all funnel through this corridor. When the Red Sea sneezes, global markets catch a cold, and the bill usually arrives in billions. Recent years have made that clear. Attacks on commercial vessels linked to the Yemen conflict, documented by shipping industry reports and NATO maritime briefings, have driven up insurance costs and forced ships to reroute thousands of kilometers around Africa. The joke in maritime circles is that it's sometimes cheaper to sail around the planet than through the Red Sea. Unfortunately, that joke comes with very real consequences. Against this backdrop, Ethiopian Defense Minister Engineer Aisha Mohammed and U.S. Africa Command leadership signed a framework designed to deepen defense collaboration, intelligence sharing, joint planning, and operational coordination focused on Red Sea and Gulf of Aden security. U.S. officials described it as a strict military cooperation framework, a phrase that signals structure and limits rather than open-ended commitments. General Dagvin Anderson, commander of U.S. Africa Command, called the Red Sea a region of global consequence where instability can ripple across trade, energy flows, and international peace. That assessment mirrors warnings from the World Bank and energy agencies that prolonged disruption in the corridor could destabilize global supply chains. Here's where Ethiopia quietly changes the conversation. Ethiopia has no coastline, but it is one of Africa's most trade-dependent economies. The vast majority of its imports and exports move through Red Sea ports, particularly Djibouti, with growing use of Berbera and regional logistics corridors. When maritime routes are threatened, Ethiopia's factories, exporters, and industrial parks feel it immediately. Threatened, Ethiopia's factories, exporters, and industrial parks feel it immediately. So Ethiopia stepping into Red Sea security is not symbolic, it's strategic self-preservation. Security analysts note that modern defense planning no longer stops at borders. Trade corridors, ports, and shipping lanes are now treated as strategic terrain. Ethiopia's leadership appears to have embraced that reality early and decisively. The agreement includes cooperation on maritime domain awareness, intelligence sharing related to terrorism and piracy, joint training to improve interoperability, and institutional capacity building in logistics and command systems. These are the fundamentals of modern military power, not ceremonial upgrades. Crucially, officials were clear about what the agreement does not do. It does not authorize permanent foreign bases in Ethiopia, and it does not obligate Ethiopia to automatically participate in future U.S. military operations. That clarity appears aimed at calming domestic audiences and regional neighbors who get nervous whenever great powers start shaking hands too enthusiastically. Engineer Aisha Mohammed emphasized that the framework is based on mutual respect and sovereignty rather than dominance. In diplomatic language, that translates to cooperation without subordination, a message carefully calibrated for both domestic and regional consumption. And then there's Ethiopia's military itself. Often underestimated, Ethiopia maintains one of the largest and most experienced armed forces in sub-Saharan Africa. According to assessments from international defense institutes, Ethiopian forces have decades of operational experience in peacekeeping, counterinsurgency, and regional stabilization missions. This is not a military that only performs on parade day. Ethiopian troops have served in missions across Somalia and Sudan, earning a reputation for endurance and adaptability. They may not always grab headlines, but in military terms, reliability is currency, and Ethiopia has built a sizable reserve of it. One regional analyst joked that Ethiopia's defense philosophy seems to be simple. No coastline, no problem. If security moves offshore, Addis Ababa is prepared to follow it, paperwork in hand and patience intact. The Cairo connection adds another layer to the picture. Before arriving in Addis Ababa, U.S. officials met Egyptian leadership to discuss Nile water diplomacy, Red Sea security, and Horn of Africa stability. Diplomatic sources say Sudan, Eritrea, and the risk of proxy escalation in the Red Sea were central topics. The sequencing suggests a coordinated regional approach rather than isolated bilateral deals. From Washington's perspective, securing the Red Sea requires cooperation with multiple regional anchors. Egypt controls the northern gateway, Djibouti hosts international naval assets, and Ethiopia anchors the political and economic heart of the Horn. You don't stabilize a corridor by talking to only one player. Critics inside Ethiopia have urged caution, warning that deeper military cooperation could draw Addis Ababa into broader great power rivalries. Government officials respond that cooperation does not mean alignment and capacity building does not equal entanglement. The emphasis, they insist, remains defensive and peace-oriented. Economics sits at the heart of this calculation. The World Bank has repeatedly documented how maritime instability raises transport costs, disrupts supply chains, and weakens investor confidence. For Ethiopia's industrialization drive, secure maritime routes are not optional, they are foundational. As one Ethiopian analyst put it, geopolitics becomes very real when containers stop arriving. Suddenly, strategy shows up at the factory gate. By linking military cooperation directly to maritime stability, Ethiopia and the United States are connecting security to development, defense planning to economic resilience. That reflects a modern understanding of power, one where stability is measured not just in territory held, but in trade protected. The Red Sea remains volatile, and competition in the region is intensifying, but Ethiopia has made its position clear. Not through speeches alone, but through structured agreements and strategic signaling. This is defense diplomacy with intent, cooperation with muscle, and a reminder that in today's geopolitics, even countries without coastlines can shape maritime security, sometimes quietly, sometimes deliberately, and sometimes in ways that make the entire region pay attention. We'll continue tracking how this partnership unfolds and what it means for the Horn of Africa and global security. Subscribe for daily updates.